What if I told you the biggest cover-up in history wasn't in a book? It's right in front of your eyes, because every time you've seen an Egyptian statue, a pharaoh, a queen, a god, the nose is gone, the lips are gone, the features that tell you who they were, gone. And yet the crowns are fine, the hieroglyphs are fine, the stone is fine. So tell me, how does time destroy black features but spare everything else? They say it's erosion. Nah, it's erasure. Because those faces look too familiar. Those kings and queens didn't look like the conquerors who came later. They looked like us. Broad noses, full lips, brown skin painted right onto the stone. And that terrified the people who came after them. So when invaders rolled in, Persians, Greeks, Romans, later Europeans, they didn't just steal Egypt's gold, they stole its identity. They took hammers to faces that proved civilization was built by Africans. They broke the proof so they could rewrite the story. This wasn't vandalism, it was policy. They wanted to bury a truth that would blow up their whole narrative, that Africa wasn't a place of poverty, but the birthplace of power. You can still see it in the marble dust. Clean chisel cuts right through the nostrils, every single time. Not random, not weather, intent. 1,000 years of colonizers taking the same swing, trying to make sure the world forgot that the first kings didn't come from Greece or Rome. They came from the Nile. And here's the punchline. It didn't work. Because under the cracks, the evidence is still there. The hair on the mummies, the pigment on the walls, the DNA in the bones. You can smash a nose, but you can't erase the truth. The builders of Egypt were black. When the Greeks and Romans marched into Egypt, they didn't just find temples, they found proof that the people they called barbarians had already mastered everything they were still learning. The invaders couldn't match the engineering. They couldn't decode the medicine. They couldn't believe that the pyramids and libraries were the work of dark-skinned Africans who worshipped, wrote, and ruled long before Europe even had a word for civilization. So they did what insecure conquerors always do. They rewrote the story. They took the gods, renamed them, and painted themselves into the legend. They ordered their sculptors to copy the pharaoh's crowns, the headdresses, the posture, but not the faces, because those faces told the truth. The first step in rewriting history isn't changing the words, it's changing the image. Once the Greeks ruled through the Ptolemies, and later when the Romans took over, they funded new sculptures with European features, narrow noses, thinner lips, lighter stone. They plastered their versions of Egyptian beauty on top of the originals. It was ancient propaganda. Centuries later, European explorers dug up the broken statues and called it discovery. But they didn't just record what they saw, they interpreted it to fit their story. When Napoleon's men marched into Egypt in 1798, they catalogued every artifact, every wall, every carving. They knew the truth immediately. Some even wrote that the faces were Negroid. But those reports, quietly buried, the ones that made it into textbooks, the ones that sanitized Africa out of Egypt entirely. That's why in every museum today, you see rows of broken faces, neatly labeled weathered by time. But ask any sculptor, ask any restorer, the breaks aren't random, they're deliberate. The chisel marks are clean, right where the nostrils meet the cheek. It's not erosion, it's extermination of evidence, of memory, of identity. And they did it because they were afraid of the day the world would connect the dots and realize the same Africa they called primitive built the foundation of their entire civilization. Fast forward to the 1800s. Colonial Europe is in full swing, building empires, enslaving nations, stealing everything that wasn't nailed down. They looted tombs, shipped the statues back to London, Paris, and Berlin, and lined them up in glass cases. And once again, they lied. They looked at brown paint on the statues and called it symbolic. They looked at tightly coiled hair on mummies and called it a trick of preservation. They found Nubian artifacts in royal tombs and labeled them foreign imports. Every piece of evidence screamed African, but the narrative whispered Mediterranean. They couldn't let the world see that Africa was the mother of knowledge, that Egypt was the child of Nubia, that civilization flowed north from the Nile, not south from Greece. So they made Egypt white. They published books showing pale-skinned pharaohs ruling under the desert sun. They hired painters to restore ancient art by lightening the skin tones. They built entire museum wings celebrating Western discovery, while the original builders were written out of the story. Even the word Egyptologist became a badge of ownership, a way for outsiders to claim authority over a culture they barely understood. They weren't uncovering history, they were repackaging it. And here's the irony. The artifacts they used to push that lie are now the same artifacts exposing them. Modern technology, DNA analysis, pigment scans, forensic reconstruction, is bringing the truth back to life. Every test, every reconstruction, every data point points south. Sudan, Nubia, Kush. The ancestral root of Egypt's greatness was African to its core. So when you walk through those museums today and stare at rows of faceless statues, don't just see broken stone, see the evidence of a centuries-long cover-up. Because those missing noses aren't accidents, they're confessions. In ancient Egypt, the face wasn't just decoration, it was divine technology. The Egyptians believed breath was life, and the nose was the gateway to that life. When the gods created humanity, they breathed spirit through the nostrils. So when you see a nose smashed off a statue, it wasn't vandalism, it was execution. It was how conquerors killed a god twice, once in spirit, once in memory. Every broken nose was a ritual act of domination. To them, a statue with a full face still lived. It still carried the presence of the person it represented. Destroying the nose meant stealing its breath, silencing its spirit. But what made this violence even more symbolic was whose faces were being silenced. Because the features they attacked weren't random, they targeted the ones that made those statues undeniably African. Wide nostrils, full lips, rounded cheeks. You can see the precision in the chiseling. The blow always aimed right between the nostrils, or across the bridge, designed to erase the most distinct marker of African identity. Even the Great Sphinx of Giza, once bearing a proud, unmistakably African face, wasn't spared. Early sketches and Arab historians describe its nose long before Napoleon's cannons and British explorers ever arrived. But by the time Western expeditions took their official photographs, the face was already mutilated. The story changed again. It was the wind, it was erosion, it was time. Convenient excuses that repeated like a mantra, generation after generation. But think about it. The Sphinx is carved from solid limestone, its body exposed to the same winds, same sand, same centuries. The body's still intact. The nose is gone. Coincidence? Not a chance. They didn't just destroy stone. They destroyed connection between Africa and its descendants, between power and its original source. Because a full, unbroken African face staring proudly from the sands of Giza would have shattered their entire narrative of racial hierarchy. When the conquerors looked up at those statues, they saw themselves reflected nowhere. No pale skin, no straight noses, no thin lips. They saw a history that didn't belong to them, and they couldn't stand it. So they did what weak men always do when confronted by truth. They destroyed what they couldn't compete with. They left the crowns because they loved the idea of empire. They left the bodies because they admired the power. But they broke the faces because they hated the reminder that Africa was first. That's the cruel poetry of it. The most recognizable part of the human body, the part that breathes, smells, speaks, became a weapon in the war against identity. By erasing the face, they could pretend Africa never led the world. By erasing the breath, they could silence generations. But the joke's on them, because every missing nose now screams louder than 1,000 lectures. It says someone was so threatened by what this face represented that they had to destroy it. And the more you look, the louder that truth gets. To understand how far this erasure went, you have to look south, to Kush, the Black Kingdom that gave Egypt its kings more than once. These were the Nubians, the dark-skinned rulers from the land, now called Sudan. When Egypt fell into chaos, it was these same people who restored order. The 25th dynasty, the so-called Black Pharaohs, ruled Egypt with pride, strength, and an unshakable sense of identity. They built temples, expanded education, revived art, and defended their land from Assyrians and Persians. But when historians later wrote about this era, they barely gave it a footnote. Some even called it the Ethiopian interlude, as if it were a brief interruption in a story that belonged to someone else. But here's the truth. They don't teach. These weren't outsiders. The Nile didn't divide them. It connected them. Egypt was Africa's northern crown, and Kush was the beating heart that pumped life through it. The Nubian kings, Pi, Shabaka, Taharka, Tantamani, were the living proof that black leadership wasn't a one-time miracle. It was tradition. When Pi conquered Egypt, he didn't destroy it. He restored it. His inscriptions, still carved in stone, read like declarations of divine mission. He saw himself not as a usurper, but as the rightful heir to Egypt's sacred legacy. And Taharka, he wasn't just a king, he was a symbol of global power. His reign stretched from the Nile Delta down into Nubia, reaching as far as modern-day Palestine. Even the Bible mentions him by name, recognizing his might. The Assyrians feared him, the Hebrews respected him, and centuries later, the Greeks quietly borrowed from him. So why doesn't the world know his story? Because Taharka's very existence breaks the illusion that Africa was ever beneath anyone. His reign proves that black men once sat on thrones that Europe hadn't even dreamed of building yet. That's why, when invaders came, the first thing they targeted wasn't the land, it was the legacy. They wiped names from walls, they defaced monuments, they burned scrolls. They wanted to erase every trace of a time when the Nile's kings were unmistakably African. You can see the fear of those conquerors in what they destroyed. They didn't just deface pharaohs, they mutilated Nubian queens too. Statues of Amanirenas, Amanishakheto, and Amanitor, queens who led armies and negotiated peace with Rome, bear the same scars: missing noses, missing lips, missing identity. They feared them because these women didn't bow. When Caesar sent envoys to demand tribute, the queens of Kush sent soldiers instead. They stood as living reminders that African leadership didn't end with men, and it didn't end with Egypt. That's the power those broken statues still hold. Every scar is a reminder that someone tried to silence a dynasty that once ruled with intellect, beauty, and pride, and failed. Because no matter how many faces they disfigured, the bloodline of greatness kept flowing. Through Nubia, through Ethiopia, through every descendant whose reflection still carries those same features, the same noses, the same lexi, the same legacy. And that's what makes the missing faces so poetic. The very features they tried to erase are the ones that survived, not in stone, but in us. This response was truncated. Choose a model with a larger context window. What if I told you the most significant cover-up in history isn't hidden in dusty tomes, but is staring you right in the face? Every time you gaze upon an Egyptian statue, be it a pharaoh, a queen, or a deity, their noses and lips are conspicuously absent. The features that reveal their identity have been deliberately erased, yet the crowns remain intact, the hieroglyphs untouched, the stone unscathed. So how does time selectively erase black features while sparing everything else? They call it erosion, but let's call it what it truly is: erasure. These faces look too familiar, too much like us. The kings and queens of ancient Egypt bore broad noses, full lips, and brown skin painted onto stone. This reality terrified the conquerors who followed: Persians, Greeks, Romans, and later Europeans. They didn't just plunder Egypt's gold, they stole its identity. They wielded hammers against faces that proved civilization was built by Africans, breaking the evidence to rewrite history. This wasn't mere vandalism, it was policy. They sought to bury a truth that would dismantle their narrative: that Africa wasn't a land of poverty, but the cradle of power. Yet, despite their efforts, the truth endures. Underneath the cracks, the evidence remains: the hair on mummies, the pigment on walls, the DNA in bones. You can smash a nose, but you can't erase the truth. The builders of Egypt were black. The great cover-up begins. When the Greeks and Romans invaded Egypt, they didn't just find temples, they found proof that the so-called barbarians had mastered what they were still learning. The invaders couldn't match the engineering, decode the medicine, or believe that the pyramids and libraries were the work of dark-skinned Africans. So they did what insecure conquerors do. They rewrote the story. They took the gods, renamed them, and inserted themselves into the legend. Sculptors were ordered to replicate the pharaohs' crowns and postures, but not their faces. The first step in rewriting history isn't changing the words, it's altering the image. The Greeks and Romans funded new sculptures with European features: narrow noses, thinner lips, lighter stone. It was ancient propaganda. Centuries later, European explorers unearthed these broken statues and called it discovery. But they didn't just record what they saw, they interpreted it to fit their narrative. When Napoleon's men catalogued Egyptian artifacts in 1798, they knew the truth. Some even noted the Negroid features, but those reports were buried. The textbooks that emerged sanitized Africa out of Egypt entirely. In museums today, rows of broken faces are labeled weathered by time. But ask any sculptor or restorer, the breaks aren't random, they're deliberate. The chisel marks are clean. By the 1800s, Europe wasn't just rewriting Egypt, it was profiting off it. Colonial powers turned the land of the Nile into a showroom, a treasure chest to raid and display in the halls of empire. Napoleon's expedition in 1798 was the prototype. Behind the soldiers came the scholars, artists, engineers, archaeologists, all armed with sketchbooks, measuring tools, and an agenda. They cataloged everything, but they didn't come to learn, they came to own. Their reports filled shelves back in Paris, London, and Berlin. They called it Egyptology, but what it really was a rebranding campaign. They took African monuments, stripped them of context, and reintroduced them as trophies of European intellect. The message was clear: we are the new keepers of civilization. But look closely at their findings: the first sketches, the color plates, the early museum acquisitions, and you'll see the lies start to form. When these expeditions unearthed statues with dark pigment, wide noses, or curly hair, they didn't call them Egyptian. They called them Nubian, foreign, or degraded. When they found art with lighter tones or finer features, they called those true Egyptian. They weren't recording data, they were coding race into history itself. Even the most famous artifacts weren't safe. The Rosetta Stone, hailed as the key to understanding hieroglyphics, was paraded as proof of European brilliance, even though it was found on African soil, written in African script, and deciphered using Arabic knowledge. Western scholars erased the Middle Eastern and African contributions, crediting themselves as the discoverers of a language that had been studied by African priests for thousands of years. And when it came to the statues, those faces that told the story no book dared tell, the defacement continued. In European hands, restoration meant reconstruction. Museum workers reshaped features, smooth noses, even re-sculpted lips to fit a classical ideal. Then they painted the replicas in marble white, like Greek gods. This is how Egypt went from Africa's crown jewel to Europe's adopted child. This is how the greatest black civilization on earth was stripped of color, identity, and origin, until it looked nothing like the truth. They didn't just loot artifacts, they looted identity. Every obelisk standing in a European square, every mummy behind glass, every pharaoh on a museum wall is a stolen piece of proof. Proof that the foundations of math, medicine, architecture, and governance were laid by people with dark skin and broad noses. Proof that Europe's enlightenment was built on stolen African knowledge. But that proof is whispering louder every year, because no matter how carefully they tried to hide it, every record they made, every sketch they drew, every pigment they scraped off, is now being used to expose them. When Western historians couldn't argue the visuals anymore, they tried to fight with science, but science turned on them. In the 20th century, when DNA testing, craniofacial analysis, and pigment studies became tools of archaeology, something uncomfortable started to happen. The data didn't match the narrative. Samples from mummified remains, hair, skin tissue, bone, revealed what generations of people already knew. Egypt was not a white or Mediterranean civilization. Its rulers, workers, priests, and scholars came from a gene pool firmly rooted in the African continent. In 2017, a massive DNA study on ancient mummies made headlines because the results seemed to show Middle Eastern ancestry. But buried deep in the study, the part most news outlets ignored, was the truth. The samples came from a single heavily mixed region during a period of Greek occupation. When other mummies, older ones, were tested, their genetic markers lined up with modern Nubians and Sudanese populations. Even the physical evidence was undeniable. Artists had painted the pharaoh's skin tones right onto the walls, red-brown for men, deeper brown for women. They weren't guessing, they were painting what they saw. Hair analysis added another blow. The strands found on royal mummies weren't straight, they were tightly coiled, the kind you still see across Africa today. The more science advanced, the more it vindicated what Egypt's neighbors, and its own art, had always said: this was an African civilization through and through. But the institutions that built their prestige on the old story didn't want to let it go. Museums quietly edited their plaques. Textbooks danced around the findings. News anchors used vague language, like complex ancestry or multi-ethnic region, anything but the one word they couldn't say out loud: black. And that's where the hypocrisy comes full circle. For centuries, they called Africa primitive to justify conquest. But when faced with proof that Africa built pyramids before Europe built plumbing, they panicked. Because if you admit that the world's first doctors, architects, and mathematicians were African, you have to admit what came after: that colonization was theft, not progress. That slavery wasn't bringing civilization, it was destroying it. So they hid behind euphemisms. They said North African, they said Mediterranean, they said mixed. But the art still speaks. The DNA still speaks. The hieroglyphs still spell out the truth. Kemet, the Black Land, named for its soil, named for its people. You can't whitewash science forever. The more they test, the darker the picture becomes. Here's what's poetic about all this. The very artifacts they used to rewrite history are now the ones rewriting it back. Digital artists, historians, and African scholars are using the same 3D scanning tech the museums used. But this time, they're rebuilding the faces honestly. They're restoring the broken noses, the full lips, the dark skin tones. They're taking the fragments of what was stolen and breathing life back into them, one scan at a time. Online, millions of people are seeing what the world tried to hide. They're seeing Ramses II, Amenhotep, Hatshepsut, and Nefertiti, with features that actually match the geography, the art, and the science. They're seeing the truth that was chiseled away. And what's wild, the backlash is instant. The moment an artist posts a reconstruction showing a dark-skinned pharaoh, the comment sections explode. That's not accurate. They weren't black. Stop rewriting history. But think about that. Who's really rewriting? The people putting noses back on, or the ones who broke them off? Every angry comment is proof that the lie is cracking. Because deep down, the world knows it's been sold a fantasy. And once you see through that fantasy, once you realize the civilization that built the pyramids was African, you can't unsee it. The truth is like sunlight hitting old stone. It burns through the dust. It exposes everything. And now the same features they tried to erase are showing up on screens, on murals, on art all over the diaspora. From Harlem to Johannesburg, people are drawing those noses again, painting those lips again, claiming those crowns again. They broke the statues, but they didn't break the spirit. The faces are rising again, not from the sand, but from memory, from the hands of the descendants who still carry those same features, the same DNA, the same pride. The broken stone was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of the awakening. Here's the part nobody wants to talk about. Egypt's whitewashing wasn't just about statues. It was about systems. Because once you control the image of where civilization began, you control who the world believes deserves to rule it now. When Europe stole Egypt's image, it didn't stop at museums. They built entire ideologies on it. They told generations of people that civilization was born white, that Africa was the student, not the teacher. And that lie became the backbone of colonialism, the justification for slavery, the root of every racist science that came after. Think about it. If you convince the world that greatness has a color, then you can sell oppression as natural order. If you erase black pharaohs, you can build white kings. If you erase Nubian queens, you can rewrite femininity. If you erase African engineers, you can rewrite genius itself. That's how powerful this lie was. It didn't just rewrite the past, it dictated the future. It told Europe they were saviors, not thieves. It told Africa it was cursed, not stolen from. It told black people around the world that their ancestors built nothing, so they should expect nothing. And once that lie was rooted, it spread everywhere. In textbooks, in movies, in religion, in art. Hollywood turned Cleopatra into Elizabeth Taylor. School books called the pyramids mysteries. Paintings of Jesus, kings and philosophers, all quietly inherited Egypt's stolen glow. They gave the world a counterfeit light, and it blinded entire generations. Even worse, that same system trained us to question ourselves. When we see evidence of African brilliance, we second-guess it. When we see dark skin in ancient art, we call it symbolic. When we hear about African innovation, we call it influence, not origin. That's how you colonize the mind, not with chains, but with doubt. But now, that same lie is starting to collapse under its own weight, because the receipts are everywhere. The manuscripts, the skeletons, the maps, the art, every piece of evidence that survived the chisels is screaming the same thing. Africa was first. Africa was genius. Africa was global. They built their empire on a lie, and now the truth is kicking in the door. Every missing nose, every cracked lip, every scarred statue, that was their way of saying, we win. But the world doesn't work like that anymore. Those broken faces are coming back to life, and every scar they left behind has become a symbol of resistance. Because here's the truth they didn't plan for. You can't destroy what's already alive in the people. They broke the statues, but they couldn't break the bloodline. The same features they tried to erase are walking through every city on earth right now, breathing, speaking, building, remembering. We're the proof they failed. Every time a black child learns about Mansa Musa, or Taharqa, or Nefertiti, and sees themselves in that story, another crack forms in the foundation of their lie. Every time we speak the real names, Kush, Kemet, Nubia, the dust shakes off those tombs a little more. History isn't repeating itself, it's reviving itself. Now the world is watching African scholars lead the research, African artists lead the restoration, and African voices tell their own story again. That's the revenge, not violence, but visibility. The same statues they tried to hide are becoming memes, murals, documentaries, viral posts. What they buried is now trending, and the more they fight it, the louder it gets. Because this isn't just about Egypt anymore, it's about the blueprint. If you can erase Egypt, you can erase Mali. If you can erase Mali, you can erase the Moors. If you can erase the Moors, you can erase the builders of the Americas. And once the world starts connecting those dots, the whole house of lies burns down. This is why they fear the truth. Because truth doesn't ask for permission, it replaces power. And once you know who you come from, you stop playing small. So the next time someone tells you those statues just weathered away, remember what they're really saying. Please don't wake up. Because if we do, if we remember what those broken faces meant, we won't just rewrite history, we'll rewrite the world.